In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives.
I
How to fight
guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Arma verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When
explanation.
Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Lynch. I'm delighted to welcome you to this, our first class in the Living Literature series. Today we'll be talking about Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and perhaps talk about the fact that what we're doing here this morning is performing at least two unnatural acts, it seems to me. The first being that we're going to sit around and talk about literature that was written thousands of years ago in this case. And the other unnatural act, it seems to me, is we're doing it in front of television cameras in a studio, which is most unusual, I think. I'd like to start with that question of why you would spend your time doing this. I'm told in the Chicago area there are at least 15 talk shows on any given day. And you could be doing any of a number of productive things with your lives in the next several hours, but you're going to spend them sitting around talking about old literature. And I wonder if anybody can help me understand why you would do this. Yeah.
For me, it's like getting acquainted with old friends. As a child, I spent a lot of time reading these books.
Yes, good for you. Yeah, these things are very foundational. Many of the works that we're going to read this term are very foundational. That is, that you probably did get exposed to the creation stories in Adam and Eve, for example, as a child. And I'd almost be willing to hazard that you haven't gone back to them.
Yes.
Since oh, have you? Yeah. Okay. That's rather rare. That's rather rare. Usually we learn this early on, and then we kind of let it go, and go on to other things. Yeah.
Well, I also read these, many of these, a long time ago, but I was younger and much more naive, I hope.
Yes.
than I
Yeah.
am now, and I'd like to see what they're like in my current context and context of other people.
Yeah. Let me assure you, they'll be different. I think you know that. Yeah. That's absolutely true. That's part of the vitality of everything that we're going to read this term. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the old Mark Twain quotation about how he couldn't believe how stupid his father was when he was 18. And at 21, he couldn't believe how much his father had learned in just 3 years. Yeah, good for you. You will find that the works really will have changed for you. That's part of the vitality of the works we're reading. It pays to go back to them repeatedly. And each time you go back to them, they give you a little bit more. Both insights into the works themselves and insights into self, I think, which is the angle I want to take this semester.
I believe that, like Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think dialogue, this method, I learn more than if I just read the work myself.
Well, good for you. That's another very important thing about coming together to talk about literature. This seems to me one of the great joys. This is fun. This is supposed to be fun. There is one relationship to the text when you are alone with it. There is a completely different relationship with the text when you share it with a group. And it seems to me that that sharing also communicates the vitality of the texts.
Someone mentioned it was because like bringing back an old friend, and for me it's almost the opposite. I grew up in a very rural part of Nebraska where we really had no libraries and very few of the classics were taught. So a lot of it I wasn't familiar with and didn't really realize I was missing it until I saw how my son looks at literature now that he's been taking into his second year of the English through the humanities at HF, and how his outlook is different than my oldest son. who did not have that opportunity at HF because it wasn't taught then.
Yeah, you're both hitting on a notion that I think is important. You both seem to be suggesting that exposure to these texts does something good for the self. Anybody want to run with this a minute? What good does it do?
Well, I think it is a time for reassessing. We get to a certain point in our lives where we need to go back to foundations and think how it applies to your life. I think when we first read these things, it was an assignment in school, and we just had to get through it, and that was it. But these have lasted for centuries, and there must be great truths in there that we can feed upon and help ourselves, I think.
Yeah, one of the really horrible things we do to students in America is make high school students read Shakespeare. How many generations of American students have been turned off to Shakespeare because they were forced to read it in a high school class? They saw no value in it at all. Those texts are extremely difficult. Let's not pretend otherwise. Hamlet is a tough read, and to inflict that on a 15-year-old is punishment worse than death, I think.
And I would like to say that I think a lot of that can depend on the teacher, too.
Oh, of course.
If you had Sister Thomas, really, she converted, even the boys were very much into Shakespeare.
Yeah.
We all loved it.
You are absolutely right, and that, of course, is one of the weaknesses of the system. It depends so much on that excellent teacher.
Or maybe whoever is the one who introduces you to it. There was a lot of this in my home. My parents were interested in read to us, when we were little. And then in school, I had the, required number. Still, some of the ones on our reading list, I see that I have read. Others I've only read about.
Yes, sure.
And even some of them I've read parts, but not all. And it's been a long time for most of them. And so I thought, if I took this course, I would read them.
Yeah.
And I would have a different context.
This is what's going to be great fun for us, is that so many of you have been exposed to these already. You've read them, you have attitudes about them. Most of them you've at least heard about. Obviously, I didn't go off into any little byways here. I'm right on the main highway of the Western tradition here. And you'll bring so many different experiences to bear on the text. And I got to tell you, as I look around, you are not the age of the normal class that I teach. I'm at I mean, don't take that in the wrong way. But down at Eastern, where I am, we're 18 to 22-year-old students. We are traditional students. And I got to tell you, I cannot wait to do Genesis and Job and Homer and Oedipus and Antigone and major texts like this with people who have some life experience. I've never done it before, and this is going to be a real treat for me.
Well, that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about a course like this, is that we're not going to be taught it. We're all teachers, and we're all going to be learning from each other.
That's correct.
And these are universal themes, which we don't discuss in our everyday life. And here we're going to do it, and these ideas are always open to different interpretations, and that's what's going to make this thing so exciting, I think.
I asked this question of Maynard Mack, who is the editor of our Norton Anthology of World Masterpieces. I did a little journey. He's the father of one of my best friends. He's a retired Sterling professor of English at Yale. And we did a little trip to New Haven to his house. And I asked Maynard Mack, why read this stuff? And one of the things I posited was that one does it to enlarge the sense of self. That is, you vicariously experience through these works universal human emotions, universal human experiences. And in doing so, one enlarges the self, the boundaries of the self, and takes in the experiences of these texts. Let's take a look at that interview with Maynard Mack.
Well, it does, of course. It does it, in part at least, by giving us, I think what somebody once called a repertory of other possible attitudes, other possible ways of life, other possible experiences. We can never have all the experiences they are ourselves vicariously. However, we can extend ourselves so that we can have some understanding of many things that otherwise we'll remain ignorant of, and therefore narrower, more shrunken in than any human being really ought to want to be. and I think more than most human beings do want to be. So I think to read things like Oedipus and discover that all the time you are the cause of your troubles, not somebody else. It's really one of the great lessons that one needs to learn, is not to create somebody else as the victim, but to recognize that, you know, Turnus, Dido, Juno, all those people, Hamlet, Claudius, they're all in us. They're all parts of us. They're all things we can be if we want to, and insist on being, or things we can aspire to, which are sometimes harder, some of those things. So, yes, finally, I think that's what great literature is about. Always about us, always about the self which we have. And the self doesn't change a very great deal, even though the superficial sides of it do over centuries, obviously. Men still hate, men still love, men still build, they tear down. We are very different. So I think it's that basic humanity that one would like to have as many students as possible come in contact with, the very widest sense of what they can be, what people have been, and what might be again.
As we can see from the Mack interview, one of the things that Professor Mack stresses is the common humanity we share with those who came before us. And indeed, that's going to be one of the real pleasures in this course, it seems to me, as we see that Adam and Eve really are not very different from us, that the dilemma that Job faces is not different at all from the dilemmas that we face in almost everyday life, that the dilemma that Hector faces in Iliad really will ring true to you. But I want to also stress something that Mack doesn't point out, not because he doesn't know it, I assure you. He is one of the world's great scholars, but he just chose not to stress this. And what I want to stress is the alien nature of much of what you're going to read. We should not pretend that it's an either or, that we either connect or it's alien. What I want to ask you to do is to keep both points of view, both balls in the air as you read. You will notice, for example, probably in Iliad, you will be in a very alien world, a world very different from our own. You will in Aeneid and in Dante's Inferno be in a world very different from our own. Maybe in Paradise Lost, very different. Maybe in Faust, very different. Maybe in Madame Bovary, very different. That's part of the joy, it seems to me, of this class, is that we connect and we don't connect simultaneously. And so we want to see the difference. We want to see how we're different from generations that came before us, but we also want to connect to that common humanity. And in doing so, as Mack suggests, the sense of self really is enlarged, because the things you're reading here are things that people, since the beginning of recorded history anyway, have felt compelled to put to paper. They have felt compelled, and I use that term by design, to write it down. And in writing it down, they make it permanent. They believe that what they say, whether via narrative or whatever form, is so important that future generations should share it. Thus, writing. Thus, the birth of literature. And so we might start with one of the most extraordinary words, first words, in all of literature. It boggles the imagination. The first word of Genesis 1. Bereshith is the Hebrew word. Can anybody comprehend in the beginning? Think about that. Let your imagination play with that. In the beginning. I mean, you can't do it, can you? It's like trying to hold on to infinity. You can't. It's a wonderful concept, but you can't hold it. You can't get a hold of it. You know? Here you can see in Genesis 1 obviously a tale that existed for a long time in an oral tradition. You'll notice the form of Genesis 1 is very strict. It's repetitive. It's formal. It's highly structured. Each verse beginning, and God said, and ending with, and it was good. You know, the sort of formula that one sees in the oral tradition. You'll see this again in Homer. Homer is very fond of epithets. He repeats epithets over and over and over again. It's the way that the teller remembers the tale. It becomes formalized, and it's easy to remember. Let's talk about Genesis 1 and 2. What a just 1 and 2. Let's not talk about 3 yet. What an odd thing to be doing in 1994, reading about creation. Foundational stuff, Genesis 1 and 2, written right into the fabric of our Western tradition. Can you point to those things? What's foundational in Genesis 1 and 2? What is basic?
What do you mean, the earth and the sky and the sun? I mean, our world?
Well, first you find out how the world came to be. Yes, one of the first impulses, it seems to me, behind Genesis 1 and 2 are what are known as, I'll give you a fancy word, forgive the academic fancy word, they're etiological myths. That is, they answer questions early people had about their physical existence, about their world. Why are there fish? Why are there birds? Why is there, a sky? Why is the sky blue? It's a firmament, separating the waters from the waters. There's water up there, and all you have to do is look in the water, and you see it's blue, right? And it's blue up there, and sometimes the firmament opens up and rain comes down. Things like that. Why are we afraid of snakes? Why do we wear clothes? Why is there pain of childbirth? You see what I'm doing? We can go on and on with these things. These are etiological myths. They explain why things are the way they are. So yes, just the physicality of it is basic to us. Susan?
Well, making the basic point that it wasn't always here.
That's correct.
It had a beginning.
That's correct.
Life as we know it, the planet as we know it. There was a time when it wasn't, and then there was a time when it was.
That's correct.
And there's a big difference.
And there is a force behind that was that one can identify. And that is God. Yes. Now let's talk about that character. What an interesting character that character is, huh? You want to talk to me about the God of chapter 1?
God is someone who's other than man. And I think it indicates you want to know the beginning of things, and yet there is, as you said, a force behind it all.
Yeah, but not too different from man, because there's a wonderful idea in Genesis 1 that should not be overlooked, which is that we are made in the image of God. Now, I'm a little confused here. You're made in the image of God?
That's what it said.
I'm made in the image of God?
That's what it said.
Now I'm very confused. You're female, I'm male. You're black, I'm white. Now I'm puzzled. What are we to make of this? We're made in the image of God.
God perhaps...
We all know God... Hey, wait a minute. Whoa. We all know God is a man. He's dressed in white robes. He's got a long white beard. Right? I mean, this is not open to discussion, right?
God's image is interpretive. I mean, it's rather what you want to make of it.
Yeah. What's more important here, of course, is what it says about us than what it says about the divinity. Yes. The God of Genesis 1 is very austere, isn't he? If I ask you to describe his character, can you do it? He just kind of speaks, right? And God said, what do we know about him? He kind of speaks and whoop, it happens.
Well, we know that he can do all things, and I think the image is stating the fact that we have his spirit. We have the spirit of God. And the fact that he said, and it is good, shows that he approved of mankind, he approved of what he had done. And that is very interesting. It shows that he loved what he was doing.
Yeah, and it certainly what he does conforms to the divine will, which makes it good. Notice in Genesis 1, the crown of creation, the only thing made in the image of God, is the human being. And we are told to have dominion over everything else. Over everything else. Now, those of you who are throwing red paint on women who wear furs, According to Genesis 1. You see how foundational this is? According to Genesis 1, they're there for our use. All right? There's a very strong current today to suggest that we're not different in kind. What we want to stress is what we have in common with animal creation. But there's a very strong undercurrent that says we are different. We have dominion over them.
Also says a paternalistic tone.
Sure does. It sure does. Yep. They are ours. They are lower than us in the scale of being. Absolutely true. Yep.
But yet he set limits on man. He told him not to eat from that tree of knowledge.
Now you're ahead of me.
Oh, I'm a little
now you're ahead of me. Now we're out of Genesis 1. I want to hold us to Genesis 1.
I think that God, when he said, you have dominion over all animals, means that we can use them for our good, for our benefit, for what we need them for. If we need them for warmth, I say that we should use that, because when even God used them as warmth for Adam and Eve when they were expelled.
Precisely. For centuries, this has been the justification for this. It's also been the justification for, what shall I use? Building dikes, building canals, improving on nature. Right? I mean, if we lived in Southern California, we would know all about trying to improve on nature, right? I mean, they have to get their water from another state, for crying out loud, you know? They're constantly fooling with Mother Nature. Remember that old commercial about don't fool with Mother Nature, you know? Well, Southern California fools with Mother Nature on a daily basis, and sometimes they pay for it. Yeah. A lot of this stuff is just foundational. It's just built into our attitudes, you know? Now I got something to ask of you. How about the God of chapter 2? Same God? Mm-hmm. We said the God of chapter 1 was formless. He was austere. He simply spoke and things happened. What about the God of chapter 2? I'm asking, I guess, how many of you notice a different creation story when we move from chapter 1 to chapter 2?
Actually, it's a reiteration, and it is the same story. It's just a reinforcement of what the first chapter was about.
Well, I'm not sure about that. What's the order of creation in chapter 2?
Yeah.
God first creates.
Adam.
First creates Adam. Yeah, it's almost funny. He first creates Adam, and then he creates cattle. Remember all this, you know? And he's trying to find a help meet for him, you know? And you can see poor old Adam, as he names the animals, going, hey, you know, this pig is very nice, and this cow is very nice, and this lamb is very nice, but this isn't doing it for me. And you can see God almost experimenting, and then finally he creates Eve. Eve is the last in the creation story in chapter 2. Whereas in chapter 1, generic man is the last. Also, the creation occurs in one day. We have a nice 6-day creation with a 7th day embedded right in the creation myth. A day of rest, a Sabbath, a Shabbat, embedded right in the creation story. Whereas in Genesis 2, that 6th day and day of rest is turned into a 1-day creation story. In Genesis 1, it's the separation of waters that's the key to creation, right? How about water in Genesis 2? How is man formed? Water coming up from the ground. Notice that in Genesis 1, God is called God. And in Genesis 2, he is called Lord God. You see the difference? And it's consistent all the way through. This has led scholars, let me just make a point and I'll come to this has led scholars to suggest multiple authorship. It is suggested that the earliest of the writers, the fellow who first felt compelled to tell the tale of creation, probably around 950 BC in the reign of David, a fellow called, which scholars call J, because he refers to God as Yahweh. You've all heard that term, I'm sure. That's the Lord God. You'll notice that Genesis 2 tells a little story. It's a narrative, you know, suggesting a much earlier authorship than Genesis 1. Genesis 1, they speculate, dates are bandied about left and right, but probably sometime in the 6th century. And he's referred to as P, the priestly writer. And you'll notice that, for example, the Sabbath, a priestly celebration, is embedded right in the creation. He refers to God in a plural form. He refers to God, and you'll know this term as well, as Elohim. Elohim. So you see in Genesis 1, let us make man in our image. That notion of a heavenly court, some kind of heavenly court operative. You're going to see that again, won't you, in Job, with the Satan who comes to God in this heavenly court. So very interesting here. We have probably two creation stories separated by several hundred years. Jay's version culminates in the extraordinary story of Adam and Eve. He's a punster. He loves puns. Eve is made out of Adam's rib, as you all know. Isha, from Ish. Ish, man. Isha, woman. Adam, man. Adama, ground. You hear the puns? This guy loves puns. Another sign of an older writer. So let's get our chronology then. Jay is the first author, the author of Genesis 2 and 3. He tells a tale. This God is so different, isn't he? Not this austere, mysterious character who simply speaks and it is done. This guy goes for a walk in the cool of the garden. You all remember this? And the marvelous scene in Genesis 3, how does he find out that Adam and Eve have broken his injunction?
Because they're wearing clothes.
He asks. It's amazing, he asks. He's going for a walk, He's out there going for a walk. Who told you to do that? And of course you have that marvelous scene. It's almost comic. I hope I'm not treading on toes here, but really it's almost comic, isn't it? When he says, who told you to do that? And Adam goes, she did. And God, you can see the God character turns to Eve and said, who told you to do that? It did. The serpent. And you have that wonderful human expression of, I didn't do it. They're like little kids. Oh, I didn't do it. He made me do it. She made me do it. The serpent made me do it. And you can only wonder God turning to the serpent. And of course, we don't have a talking serpent here responding to God. Wonderful scene. Just a wonderful scene. Susan?
Don't you wonder what God might have responded if they would have said, I did it?
Yeah. But that's not the...
Not one of them did.
But that's not the human way, is it?
No.
Isn't there something wonderfully truthful about that? Yes. The first transgression, and nobody wants to take responsibility for it. I didn't do it. And of course, we talk about foundational things. Centuries of anti-feminism come out of that little story of Adam and Eve. Because, of course, who fell first? Eve. Sure. And then Eve works her wiles on Adam. And traditions build up around this Eve character. We're going to meet her again. I'm planting a seed here because we're going to meet her again in Paradise Lost. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little about the trees in
Yes.
Paradise.
Yes.
God told them that they could eat from all the trees, including the tree of life, but not from the tree of knowledge.
Yes.
And
it's very troublesome, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is indeed. It is indeed. Because I quoted Mark Twain earlier in the hour. I want to do it again. Mark Twain had a great line. He said, God should have banned them from eating the serpent. You get it? What would they have done? They'd have eaten the serpent. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. There is something very troublesome here. Because in the Adam and Eve story, the Adam and Eve story has a mythic pull to it. We could all write our story of the fall, couldn't we? Because it's the movement that we have all been through. It's the movement from innocence to experience. And once you've made that move, there is no going back. It's knowing something today that you didn't know yesterday. And it's knowing it in an experiential way. It's not knowing it in the abstract. It's knowing it experientially.
But what was
And these two are changed. Well, that's what I want to know. See, what's really troublesome is, what is the thing that causes the pain? What is it that they win to that causes their fall? Knowledge. Wait a minute. Yes, right. But the truth will set you free, right? We are born to know, right? So why does this come down? Does any of you want to be Adam and Eve in the garden?
They lived an idyllic life. They were happy. They communed with God.
They were happy in the way that children were.
I think God was trying to protect them from, look at the evils of the world now because of the fall. Now they have to suffer sickness, illness, working till you're with the sweat of your brow.
And it makes us better human beings.
But there was not anything against knowledge per se. It was the knowledge of both good and evil. And the way the Garden of Eden was set up, it was for the good, for good. And so the interest of evil.
How can I know good if I don't know evil?
According to what is written, was that the evil started the woes that we've suffered through the history of mankind.
It's as though God was controlling, and he did not want them to know what he knew.
Where'd this evil come from? We just learned in Genesis 1 and 2 that everything comes from God.
They had a spirit that communed with one another. They had a spirit that communed with one another, and there was death to that spirit. They could no longer have that communication.
I totally agree with you there. Let me come to you, Peter. Let me come to you in a minute. You're right. One of the consequences of the fall is a terrible sense of alienation. It is horrible. Adam and Eve are alienated not only from God, they hide from him, remember? They literally are hiding from him. Terrible alienation. They are also alienated from the ground. Think about that. You know? Adam, Adamah, now toil, sweat, pain, labor rather than work. You know, a woman does not go into work. She goes into labor. That word has connotations of pain, doesn't it? Yeah. Childbirth will be painful. But even, I think, more to the point, they have a terrible alienation, as you point out, from one another.
Right.
Because you did it.
And from life.
You did it. Yeah, it's
Because
just...
life now ends for them, where up until that point, they are guaranteed eternal life in the garden,
Yeah.
and now that's over, they will die.
Yeah, that's right.
Whatever that means.
But isn't that good? I don't get you guys wanting to go back to the garden, where every day is the same, where there's no sense of time, there's no moral seriousness, because you're like a dog. You're instinctive. You're not making choice. You all hear me?
Curiosity.
You all hear this? You gotta make choice for moral seriousness.
They had free will. They had free will. They made the choice.
Peter, I promise to get back to you.
Yeah, I was just going to introduce that topic. We seem to have skipped over the human foundation of free will.
Yeah. Yep.
And you know, once you have free will, then you do make these. You have to make choices between good and evil, and if you know, sometimes you're going to make the wrong choice.
That's correct. That's correct. And that's what gives us our moral seriousness, is that free will. We are not beasts. We do not act on instinct. We have choice. Now there's a whole, let's stir the pot a little more. We're living toward the end of the 20th century. We live in an age of psychiatry, psychology, sociology, I'm going to get all my friends angry at me now, which says, I think I have free will, but I really don't. I am the product, after all, of my environment. I am the product of my conditioning. All right, I like to think I have free will, but I really don't. I'm really listening to inner voices that I don't understand, and I'm acting on an instinctive level. Ooh, talk about something foundational. Free will, yes. There seems to be something in creation that can run counter to the divine will, the human being and his or her freedom, or that choice that Adam and Eve made was part of the divine plan. Ooh, now the pot is truly stirred.
Yes, but if you have choices and you're not God, you're going to make some bad ones.
That's correct.
And this is the question, how does God allow these things to happen? We allow them. We have everything we need here still. But we have freedom and to use everything, everybody, all of our resources, all of our strengths, our weaknesses. We still ultimately choose. We do, and that is how evil continues to exist here.
That's our blessing and our curse, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
and in defense of Eve, I will say, as far as we know, she was the first one tempted.
That's correct. Good
And
for
that
you.
was
Yeah,
still
good for
her
you.
responsibility,
Yeah.
and that was her thing. That Adam was tempted. He could have stood there, all
Sure.
you men, you know.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
been
We're going to see this played out. I planted that seed, actually, because we're going to see this played out in very vivid terms in Milton's Paradise Lost, where he's going to write a 12-book epic based on just chapter 3 of Genesis, and he'll really flesh this out.
Doesn't this make God the tempter too? You know, he puts that tree of life and the tree of good and evil.
Yep.
And when he says, do not touch that, that is very tempting.
Oh, of course. Oh, of course. That was my joke earlier about Twain saying he should have said, "Don't eat the serpent," and they would have eaten the serpent. Isn't that human nature? You know, isn't that human nature? Don't Adam and Eve act out the essential human drama? And then I want to ask you, okay, you've all gone through the same process. You've all moved from innocence to experience. You have all learned something that you didn't know, and it probably caused you some pain. And the larger question for Adam and Eve is, how then are we to live with this? I asked the same question of Willard Galen, who is director of the Hastings Center in just north of New York City. He's the author of Adam and Eve and Pinocchio. I'll show you the book afterwards, on being and becoming human. He's one of the great medical ethicists. And he wrote a book with a marvelous title, Adam and Eve and Pinocchio. The subtitle is On Being and Becoming Human. And let's take a look at that interview if we can, and see what Galen says about Adam and Eve. I'm here at the world-famous Hastings Center just outside New York City, where I'll talk to Dr. Willard Galen, eminent psychoanalyst, about Adam and Eve. Dr. Galen is the author of Adam and Eve and Pinocchio, On Being and Becoming Human. We'll talk about Adam and Eve's struggle for human freedom and for human dignity.
You have to take the Christian gloss off of the Jewish Bible. Christians did an awful lot of things, and indeed it made them popular. They promised you heaven. They promised you fusion with the perfect person, Christ. The Jews weren't offering you anything like that. The Jews were offering you a good life. The Jews weren't interested in the individual. They were interested in the species. God made them the chosen people. There's no salvation for the individual. And everything, so it's very Aristotelian. Actually, Aristotle came later. He was very Old Testament, if you will. It's very communitarian, to use a modern word. It is the people as a whole. I would say this is the birth of the human being, that we are indeed half God's creatures and half our own designers. We were given the choice to be simply another animal with a prescribed way of life, and we chose autonomy, we chose independence. So I don't see that as a fall. I see that as actually, I don't know whether it's the rise, if not the fall, but the creation of the human being, of the species Homo sapiens, with all our variability, all our unpredictability. It certainly is the birth of morality. There can't be morality. And indeed, it's very interesting to me, thousands of years later, one of my favorite authors, William James, when he talks about the moral universe, says if there were two people stuck on a rock, an isolated rock, you would have a complete moral universe. Now it's interesting, not one person, not like Kant, not like Plato, who have ideals and beauty and truth floating all over the place. Two people into relationship. And so I think what you may be getting is the same Christian gloss that takes that magnificent, sensual, sexual hymn to human carnal love, the Song of Songs, and makes it in some kind of a ditzy thing that's supposed to be about man's relationship to Jesus. Well, any kid who reads that knows that's not what it's about. It's about love, it's about passion, it's about sex, it's about a gorgeous woman and the way a man responds to her. So I think the fall and the concept of the fall may be a post-Genesis imposition.
Okay, it'll come as no surprise to you that your comments run counter to contemporary trends. Number one, you see guilt as something positive, whereas, as you know, there's a modern cottage industry telling us that guilt is a negative emotion. And number two, you believe in autonomy. You believe in individual freedom.
You have to understand there's a difference. In my office, guilt is an emotion, and that's all it is, and innocence is a stage of life. That's all. Guilt and shame are the defining emotions. I don't feel any animals have these. Some people don't have them. We're not luckier for having those people. Unless you are raised in a caring and loving way, you create a human being who is incapable of caring and loving, who has no guilt, who has no shame, and therefore who has no adult conscience mechanism. And he is someone who only responds like the beast. He responds to the stick. He responds to punishment because he will have fear. So that guilt and shame plus pride are the foundations. That's the tripod that supports this concept called conscience. And indeed, it's only these, it's the new sort of do your own thing and just float through life and everything will be happy kind of concept that denies this. Guilt and shame are essential for the good human being. Now, as far as the second part, I am not sure that I'm individually driven. I'm a communitarian in many ways. I am responsibility driven. I'm saying that this exculpation for all behavior on the basis of psychology and sociology and what could he do, and those cops that beat up, horrible with their nightsticks bludgeoning that man, well, they're not responsible, it was the heat of the moment. And then those black guys who took that poor white, only because he was white, out of the truck and just beat him almost to death, well, they're not responsible. Well, responsibility is part of the joy and the necessity of being human beings. Animals aren't responsible. We are responsible. And exculpation just doesn't cut any ice in my book. Psychoanalysis belongs in the psychoanalytic office. And indeed, I will forgive my patients, I was going to say anything, but almost anything, let's say. But that doesn't mean that I'm a nicer guy than you when I'm at a restaurant or bar. If someone kicks me in the shins, I don't want to know whether his mother's been mean to him or not. I mean, I respond in kind, and that's the way the world runs. The sick role excuses you, and we have chosen to define these things as sick. But you cannot continue to expand the concept of sickness so that everything everybody does to every other person is exculpable. We have to have responsibility.
The struggle between security and autonomy, it does seem as if Adam and Eve are given a choice from one point of view, between security and autonomy. And they choose the courageous thing. It's difficult to choose autonomy over security. Am I falsifying their struggle by putting it in such stark terms?
Well, it may be. It's an interesting thing because it may be that they had no idea what they were choosing when they chose. That to me is one of the intriguing things. I'm not sure you could say that they chose. The writers of the book that enshrined this story clearly had it in mind that it was a choice. If you analyze the text carefully, what did they know was going to happen to them? They were told not to do it. They'd never see. Punishment was unknown. Responsibility, the word we used before, did not exist at that point. This was the birth of the concept of responsibility. I think what it does show is the power of a human imagination. And also, when God drives them out of the garden, the incredible thing is what we then, from that garden, were capable of creating. Because I think it shows the power of human curiosity, human imagination, and human hope. Because the first thing, after they go through this business saying, I didn't do it, I'm so, he did it, everybody, and all that kind of whiny little baby stuff, the first thing that happens after that, before the Cain and Abel, is the renaming of Eve and saying, And this, to me, is just goose pimple time when this happens. Here they've been kicked out of everything. They defied God. They're on their own. He draws a horrible picture. Is there then despair? Not a whit. There's no sackcloth and ashes. There's the renaming of Eve because she will be the mother of man. There is the assumption of a new life, a new birth, a new set of creatures. And if anything, that concept of hope, which is, to my mind, one of the glorious things that, animals have fear, despair, but not hope, not the hope that comes with vision. The hope that, who was it? Shelley said, to hope, how does that line? To hope till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. I mean, so that the amazing thing is the quick transition, that we're now going to people the earth. We're going to create a new set of creatures. And so the real moral is that having the curiosity, if you want, I don't even know if it's courage, because we don't know. If they didn't know the punishment, you can't say it's courage. But the impelling, driving curiosity, and then taking the punishment and adding to it the optimistic hope that there will be a future, that's the glory of those chapters.
Yeah.
That's very insightful, didn't you think? I recommend very highly this book, Adam and Eve and Pinocchio, on being and becoming human. I can share this with you after the taping. It's a terrific book by Willard Galen, the man you just met via tape. Another book I recommend to you, we were talking about it earlier, I'll show it, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent. It's by a woman named Elaine Pagels. She's I think she's at Princeton, at least the last I knew she was at Princeton. She's a historian, religious historian. And this will give you very good insight into the character of Eve, particularly through the ages. I think it's a very good book, and I recommend it to you all highly. Do you have any responses to Galen's comments? Did he seem particularly astute to you?
Well,
yes.
I sort of disagree with him. I think that God was so good that there is hope, even if they had fallen. He just was testing their obedience, and they had failed. Yet he was going to take care of them because he promised this Savior that would step on the serpent's head when he talked about Adam and Eve.
Yeah, maybe not. You'll get in a lot of debate about that from Hebrew scholars who will say that.
But after all, he did create them, and he was so good that he's going to give them some kind of a life even after they had failed.
Yeah, he certainly shows solicitous concern at the end of Book 3 by sewing clothes for them.
But he also created the snake. I mean, and here was the second chance in case he didn't get the don't eat the tree. He gave him the serpent there to back it up. I mean, he was almost had the plot in mind to begin with.
Yeah, it's a marvelous little drama, isn't it? How the serpent casts doubt on God's motives.
Just the test of obedience.
For banishing the tree. Yes?
I have a question about God.
Yeah.
And he did not have to respond the way he did. So we have to consider the sort of character that would do something like that. And there are many other options for responding to what the drama entails.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. And that a lot of people have, as I think Galen does, makes much of that solicitous concern and that extraordinary note of promise and hope at the end of Genesis 3. Galen says it gives him goosebumps to think about it. And it really is quite remarkable, isn't it? Because they are faced at the end of Genesis 3 with what you and I are faced with on a daily basis. We are fallen. It's a very interesting metaphor. It's one I don't particularly like. The fall. It has come down to us through history as the fall. I don't see it as the fall at all. I see it as the rise. I want to take that metaphor and flip it right on its head. And I want to suggest that we are better for our moral choice. We are more serious morally because of our freedom, because of our autonomy, because of our ability to make choice. This is what makes us morally serious.
Well, why then do people want to go to heaven, which is the original state that Adam was in? And that's the great big desire of all.
I got to warn you, you're out of the Hebrew Bible now. As soon as you mention heaven, as soon as you're into afterlife, you are now in a Christian realm and are not in the old Hebrew realm. They did not have that. That's a much later development in thought. Yeah, I'll address that. I'll tell you what we'll do. I'll come back to that when we talk about Job, because one of the things posited by Genesis 3, the Adam and Eve story, is what is known as a doctrine of rewards and punishments. If you are good, you will be rewarded. If you are bad, you will be punished in this life, right? And then the author of Job comes along and points out what we all know. It doesn't work that way. Wouldn't that be terrific? But it doesn't work that way. So here we are in this incoherent world. We are fallen human beings. How are we supposed to go on? How are we supposed to face tomorrow? It doesn't make any sense. It's all insane.
Well, I think when God created us, He gave us that power or the ability to have the conscience, which is, to me, that ability to fall or find the love of God. And that's our choice to find that way. He gave us that power to choose the good and the bad.
But boy, hey, look, if it was that simple, we'd all choose the good. It's like, your good isn't my good. Your bad isn't my bad. We live in this crazy relative world. Who says your good is my good? And boy, if it were as simple as knowing good from evil, well, gosh, we'd do that all the time. That's one of the things you see the Greeks are going to introduce, is that this world we live in is very shadowy. It's not bright lights like in a TV studio. It's gray. There's a lot of gray out there. It's hard to determine the good from the evil. Only the sociopath chooses the evil and takes any kind of pleasure in it.
When people do choose the good, they choose whatever they think is good and best for them at the moment, and thus the complications, thus in the moment.
Yeah. So who's going to tell me how to live? Tell me how to live, Susan.
Well, I had a thought before that, and that's I'm picking up on.
Don't dodge my question.
I just was holding that thought, But the thought was that I hadn't thought of it until we saw that clip, but you had alluded to it earlier. Is that if you turn that around just a little bit, the creation story, and make it more like the birth of a new species?
Yeah.
That the choice they had was to keep going like they were, and that's what God preferred, and according to this story, and that was an easier life, according to all the reports. Or they did have the choice to disobey, to do the other thing. But once they did that, they'd lost the old life. That's what it amounted to.
You said an easier life. Yes, it was an easier life. Is that why it was a better life?
That's apparent. I think that's what a lot of people think. That's what. But we seem to be designed problem solvers. The idea of nirvana as the end of the road doesn't appeal automatically to everybody. I heard an Australian priest say that his idea of heaven is that it allows you opportunity for continued growth and development. To me, that was appealing.
Yeah.
That's what we have is.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that there was no concept of heaven in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, that's correct.
In the Hebrew Bible, you're referring to the Old Testament?
Yes, exactly.
Then how would you explain what happened supposedly before Eve as according to the account in Isaiah?
I can't. All I can say is that
supposedly took place in heaven.
Right. Well, again, lots of controversy about this. But what there is a kind of shadowy subterranean region known as Sheol, and then one joins what are known as the fathers. One is kept in memory by the family. But there's no orthodox doctrine like you have in Christianity of an afterlife of heaven and an afterlife of hell. But there was a description
of a court, of a place, in a place,
I hear you.
in an opposite direction we think of Sheol.
Okay. I hear you.
That was in the Hebrew Bible.
Yes,
so
there is some kind of heavenly court. Yes.
Okay.
We just don't know, who or what is there. I want to get back to the much more central question, though, of do we see this as a fall or do we see this as a rise? Do you see Adam and Eve winning autonomy?
Well, I think of it as a rise. God told Adam and Eve, if he didn't want them to eat from the tree of knowledge, why did he particularly say do not? I mean, if he is paternalistic like the father, what do you do when someone tells you not to do it? You know, you want to do it, and sometimes you eventually do it. I think that was his plan all the time, that Adam and Eve would eat from the tree of knowledge, and they would go on and start a new universe, a new life. And God made man in his image. He didn't make them other gods. He made them in his image. And I think he knew man's foibles and that they would fall.
Yes.
I think, speaking about God making man in his image, I think God did know they were unfinished products. So they did not need this rise, the tree, tempt them so they could go and develop themselves further. Because when God said he made them in his image, God is supposedly perfect, and man has to spend a lifetime, and even then, striving toward more perfection. So they weren't a finished product.
It says in his image.
Yes.
In his image.
Yes.
But so to me, there's a spiritual concept. It's not the physical concept. The image is what I imagine, not what I am. Right. And so when I read that I'm made in God's image, I don't think, gee, I look like God.
Right.
Right. I think
that
of
would be
that
too limiting.
spiritual concept.
Yeah, I've ignored each side of the room here. I apologize.
If it's a record of racial beginnings, I would think that referring to God making man in his image would give that basis to those racial beginnings.
Yeah. It at least gives to man an extraordinary dignity. Can we agree with that? That man, unlike the rest of creation, is different in some very serious way, very different from the rest of creation. And indeed, with that, as centuries of tradition will point out, comes a very special responsibility as well. What's problematic, we have to wrap up now because of time, but what's very problematic for us, shall I say, at the end of Genesis 3, is what the role of knowledge is. I don't know what to make of knowledge. Is it something that's going to cause me pain? Is it something that's going to cause me ruin? Is it something that's going to bring me down? Or is it something that makes me in the image of God?